Good evening and welcome to this week's Global Christian Perspectives, or in fact good afternoon if you're in the States. I'm Chris Eyre, and with me are Elgin Hushbeck and Alan Bevere, both from the left-hand side of the Atlantic. We have a number of items on the list here, and the first item, as people are about to start actually voting in the States, is about the state of the Republican primaries at the moment. I read about this and understand very little, frankly. So, what's your feeling at the moment, Elgin? Does Trump actually have a chance of getting the nomination, and if so, winning?
At this point, I would say yes. Although I would put a huge question mark in there, is because what we've been dealing with up until this time is speculation and polls. And not only have the polls been historically bad over the last 5 to 10 years, with 2012 being an exception, but there's something even more difficult here, in that even when polls were more reliable, Iowa has always been difficult. One of the strange things about the election system here is we do our primaries, and our primaries are run by the states, and not all the states do things the same way. And so, for example, in New Hampshire, which will come after Iowa, it's more than normal. You go to a particular location and you cast your ballot, and you walk in. The Democrats will get their ballot, the Republicans will get their ballot, and their independents can select which one they want. In Iowa, it's much more difficult because you actually have to go out to a location and you caucus, which means on Monday evening, people will be going to locations, and then they'll go through a somewhat arcane and complicated process of deciding how they are going to select their nominee. And so people huddle together, they form coalitions, there's a lot of give and take, and so polling doesn't always work quite the same way, because the ultimate outcome of how someone votes may change during that particular evening. Also, there's the whole issue of going and voting is one thing, going and spending an entire evening is something different. And so organization and commitment plays a much bigger factor. So basically, we're in a speculation period now. On Monday, things begin to get real, and within about 3 weeks from now, we'll have a much better indication of where the race sits.
Okay. Have you any feelings on this, Alan?
Well, I mean, I think that this race would look differently if we currently had less persons seeking the nomination in the Republican Party. I think it would look a lot different. I don't think Donald Trump would have, he might have the lead, but I think it'd be a lot closer, because I think a lot of those who would vote for, a Mike Huckabee or a Jeb Bush are probably not going to vote for Donald Trump. And so part of the problem is we still have all these people who are in the race who frankly don't stand a chance and continue to be in the race. I mean, I will tell you as a voter, my nightmare scenario is having to choose between Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. Hillary and Bill Clinton are two of the most corrupt politicians in modern American politics. And Donald Trump is a self-absorbed narcissist. And to have to, I mean, this is one of the times when you could probably make a moral case for not voting when it's that bad. I mean, not that we always vote for candidates that agree with us on everything. I mean, we all know that that's not the way it works, and that's fine. But when you have these two options, it becomes almost an exercise in morality to say, I abstain. And so that's my nightmare scenario for the 2016.
Right.
I'm sorry?
There's always write-in.
There's always a write-in. You know, I could write an Elgin Hushbeck or something. And but it is the other question I have. I mean, and I'm thinking of the second president of the United States, John Adams, who said that politicians are only going to be as moral as the people who elect them.
Yeah.
And so I wonder what that says about the American electorate, that it looks like we might have these two options. It's very disconcerting to me.
Yeah. Actually, that Trump and Clinton wouldn't be as difficult as Trump and Sanders. Because I would pick Trump simply because of the corruption factor. Trump and Sanders would give me much more difficult choice. That would kind of be my nightmare scenario.
I have to say that from where I sit, Trump reminds me a little of Nigel Farage. I don't know if you know anything about UK politics, but Farage is the figurehead and practically the only potentially serious politician in the UK Independence Party, which is in favour of leaving Europe, closing our borders, sending immigrants back to where they came, even if they're fourth generation. And he excites an awful lot of the worst instincts of a lot of people here. But he has this fellow next door, jovial guy you meet in the pub kind of aspect to him. And he doesn't do political correctness, so yes, he's a misogynist and all that stuff, and he gets away with it because of this persona that he puts forward. And UKIP managed to get 11% of the votes in our last election, and one MP.
Yeah.
I'm very happy that it's no more than 11% and it's only one MP here. And I look at the other side of the Atlantic and I think, oh, you poor dears. You might have effectively a UKIP with a chance of being in power there. And judging by the fact that there's serious argument even in the Conservative Party at the moment as to whether they could possibly deal with Trump as a leader, things could get very interesting if he got elected.
Yeah, I know for me, I think one of the issues is there's actually a move more towards Trump, at least from what I'm hearing, away from people like Cruz. I think part of it is Trump is not a politician. He's a showman. And that explains a lot of his popularity. He's also, in my mind, a demagogue in the sense that he's tapping into the raw emotions that people here on both sides of the spectrum are angry at their politicians. And we vote for them, they go up. I think both parties have the same complaint. We vote for them, they go up, and then they kind of do their own little thing once they get there. And Trump is tapping into that. So one of my concerns is I don't think he would be as bad as his showmanship is, but I'm not sure when he got up there what he actually would do. He's a deal maker. His book is The Art of the Deal, and I don't know when he goes in to make a deal, what kind of principles is he going to have, and what is he going to actually apply? And to me, that's my biggest problems with him is the showmanship and the fact that I have really no idea where he's going to do once he gets there.
He sure doesn't talk much about. He sure doesn't talk substance when it comes to policy, other than we're going to build a wall on the northern border of Mexico, and the Mexicans are going to pay for it, which I think if there's any Trump supporters that actually think that's going to happen, you know, maybe they're all coming from Colorado where marijuana is legal to smoke. I just don't know how that happens. I mean, yeah, I mean, Elgin, I've heard the same thing about politicians when it comes to Trump and Cruz, because the Republican establishment in Washington hates Ted Cruz because he came there as a junior senator and basically painted himself as a true conservative, and the establishment conservatives as sellouts, and actually put it in one of his books. And so there's not a lot of love for Ted Cruz among Republicans.
Mm-hmm.
Well, among Republican establishment.
Establishment, right. The other thing I saw interesting today, by the way, that there was a poll taken that among evangelicals, among those sitting in the pews, Trump has like 40% of the vote compared to other Republican candidates. But when you poll the evangelical pastors, his numbers dropped to 5%. So the pastors apparently are not enthralled with him the way the parishioners are.
No, and I should explain to Chris, one of the things that causes anger at Ted Cruz is when you're a new senator, and there may be something similar in Parliament, you're expected to go and sit there and be quiet for a year or two, and until you actually then you're allowed to kind of stand up and make a speech, but it's considered your inaugural speech, and then if it's okay, then they'll start letting you do things. And Ted Cruz went in there with the idea that I'm a senator and I'm going to actually start doing things, and oh, by the way, all those promises we made, we should actually keep those. So that's where part of the problem, that's the establishment's problem with Cruz.
I can kind of understand the attitude from Cruz. I can't understand the promises he made, but I can understand the general attitude. And yes, there's a certain amount of similarity here. Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens in the next week or two at this point.
I think we'll see a lot of change.
And I'm sure this topic is not going to go away for a while. So onward. We talked about the Planned Parenthood videos a while ago, and I was very interested to see that the one result of them being investigated was not that Planned Parenthood were prosecuted, but that the people who made the videos were being prosecuted. Now, what's your feeling here, Elgin?
I don't know the details of the particular indictment. I find it actually not too surprising. I would argue, and it's my belief, that if this had been a couple of liberals who had gone in and videotaped under exactly the same circumstances, big oil or big pharmaceutical rigging prices and agreeing to do shady practices, this would not have happened. But because Planned Parenthood is one of they're part of what I call Team Democrat. They're well-known, established part of the Democratic Party. It doesn't surprise me that they get off scot-free so far, but the people who caught them on tape are being prosecuted.
Any thoughts on?
Well, I don't know, like Elgin, I don't know details either. But I would say that for me, as I had said when we talked about this the last time, that I do think that legalized abortion on demand is an unfortunate practice. I think that civilized people don't kill their children. And so, regardless of the details of what these persons did infiltrating the Planned Parenthood, whether this was somewhat trumped up or not, or however this worked, to me, there's just the larger issue that, and of course, we're in a climate where abortion on demand is legal. I don't think that's going to change, but I sure wouldn't mind having some discussion about some reasonable restrictions on practice. I mean, there are places in Europe where there are restrictions, where There are countries where you got up to the first trimester, for example. And so, I mean, there seems to be some reasonable laws that I'd like to see us think about, but everything is so polarized again that that's never going to happen. But so for me, the big issue is just the practice of abortion itself. So as far as how this plays out and what's behind it, I don't know.
Okay. It kind of looks a little different from here. We do have restrictions on abortions late term. You can't do them except in pressing medical needs circumstances. We don't have abortion on demand exactly. There has to be some medical, psychological reason for it. Though it's reasonably easy to find psychological reasons for it.
Chris, is there a when you say the restrictions, is there a certain time period where after a certain week or so you cannot get an abortion unless there's some medical reason?
Yes, there is. I forget how many weeks it is.
Okay.
There was a proposal a few years ago to reduce that because there have been cases where there has been a successful live birth earlier than that date.
Right.
When it was originally set, there had been no successful live births earlier than that date, by any means at all. Live births earlier than that date are very rare, but it is a possibility, and that was the basis of the argument for bringing it forward at the time.
Here you can have abortions up to the day of. I mean, literally, the woman could be decided to go to the hospital to give birth or go to an abortion clinic to have an abortion. And one of the reasons abortion is so polarizing here is because we aren't allowed to make reasonable distinctions. Essentially, the Supreme Court ruled back in 1973 in Roe versus Wade that there was a constitutional right to abortion, and since then, the amount of restrictions you can place on an abortion have been extremely limited. So that has abortion was legal in this country up until before 1973, and several states had legalized it, and the trend was actually towards more legalization. But this was a case where one side got the court to rule in their favor, and now we have locked in an extremist view, and so it's been taken out of the area where reasonable people could agree, and to get a change, virtually every little change gets fought all the way up to the Supreme Court.
Right.
So that's what caused a lot of the polarization.
You know what fascinates me, I've thought about it from time to time, is that when you look at countries in Europe compared to the United States, I mean, Europe tends to be more liberal in various aspects than the United States, and yet our politics is so polarized that it's either all or nothing. And so it's almost as if you can't, as Al just says, reasonable people can't sit down and hammer something out that at least is acceptable to both sides, giving a little and taking a little. It's so we're quote unquote more liberal on abortion in our laws than certain countries in Europe, which are by and large more liberal than the United States.
We had a discussion and we came to a compromise, essentially.
Our courts have not allowed us to do that.
Our courts have no say in it. It was an act of Parliament.
Yeah.
Well,
that's one of the continued discussions we have over here is where do you legislate this, and where do you leave these issues to legislature, and where do you fight it out in the court? The court had almost become, in some ways, at times for some of us, the de facto legislature on some issues.
It is. I mean, same-sex marriage in this country was opposed in the polls consistently until the court decided to mandate it, and Now it's the law of the land, not because it was reasonable people came together and reached a consensus. It was just basically forced upon us.
And
It remains to be seen whether that will induce a polarization as abortion did. But that's actually been the trend here is conservatives have fought and won and then lost in the courts.
okay, I again here same-sex marriage was an act of Parliament, and there wasn't actually very much dissent on that one. We don't seem to have the same fault lines running through our politics as you do on those topics. On economic topics, maybe we have the same ones, but an interesting.
Well, I think from some of my time in the UK, I mean, it just became clear to me that you do not really bundle up issues the way we do. Often, I'm not saying one way is right and one way is necessarily wrong. I'm just saying that it just you make connections in the UK, or you don't make connections in a way that's different from what happens here. I don't know if part of that is the result of a two-party system, basically, that we have here, whereas you have more than two parties, correct? Okay. Judging from your smile, okay, it's complex.
it's complex. We mostly have a two-party system, but there's a third party with tolerable size, and then it gets really complex.
Okay.
Because actually, the third party in number of MPs is the Scottish National Party, which is a separatist party for Scotland alone. And this is a bit like having a separatist party for, shall we say, Dixie or something like that.
But we had that. It was called the Civil War.
I don't think we're going to repeat that exercise, whatever happens.
That's good.
I think you had one of those before we did.
We had one or two of those before.
Yeah, we were just following your example.
Okay, we've got two more topics coming along. We're near to the half-hour point, and I thought it would be a good moment for us to introduce ourselves a little more. In my case, there's very little more to introduce. I'm Chris Eyre. I'm from England. I'm one of Energian's editors, and that's about it. Elgin.
I'm Elgin Hushbeck. I'm from Wisconsin in the United States, and I'm author of 4 books. And recently I've posted a number of articles on the Energion Discussion Network, one of which I think will be coming up here pretty quickly.
Indeed so.
Alan Bevere, pastor at the First United Methodist Church of Akron, Ohio, and a professional fellow in theology teaching at Ashland Theological Seminary. And I have a book coming out sometime this spring, a commentary on Colossians and Ephesians from the Participatory Bible Study Series. A couple other books from Energian, and I also have been doing a little blogging on Energian, and there's one post that Elgin and I, similar, same topic, and I think I've got a post coming out this coming Monday.
Okay. And on that note, because you have both done contrary blog posts on the issue of evolution, or at least to some extent, this week, Alan, I think you argued that the theory of evolution explained our world from a biological point of view.
Well, yes, and I wasn't the question the way it was posed I was not completely comfortable or happy with the way the question was posed, so I sort of did my own thing. I sensed in reading Elgin's post at the beginning he was a little he sort of did wanted to make some qualifications as well. But I just, it seems to me that evolution and the evolutionary nature of the universe just seems to be clear to me. Obviously, there are things we don't understand about it. There are questions we have about it, but that's, with anything as you're seeking knowledge. And I think it makes sense within the character of God theologically, which is the case I tried to make in my post.
Elgin, you were arguing slightly for evolution, but then not for evolution. Could you outline that a bit more?
Sure. I basically believe that this is one of the few places I guess you might say that I'm agnostic. I don't think we know enough to know exactly what happened yet, and therefore, I look at you can even look in the Bible. In some respects, the first chapter of Genesis has life appearing in a somewhat evolutionary fashion. In fact, that's one of my views of Genesis. Is that it's vague enough that it can be read to either line up with or not line up with a whole number of different theories, depending on which way you're trying to push it. So I believe God created the universe. I have no question about that. I believe He created life, and that His creation has resulted in us. How He did that exactly, I don't know. I don't think the theory of evolution has put enough puzzle pieces together to actually come up with a theory, because there's just too many holes. I want my scientific theories to be more than just descriptive. They have to have some sort of explanation or explanatory power to them, and I don't think the current theory of evolution comes even close to that.
Would you not say that we actually see evolution in action, particularly in species with short lifespans and reproductive spans?
Well, as I point out in my article, I differ between two types of evolution, which is not unique to me. Even creationists will make this point, that there's the small changes that would, say, for example, result from would explain all the dogs coming from a type of dog, or even a canine, or you can have changes within a group, but as dog breeders have discovered, the more you try to breed for certain traits, even though you're carefully selecting them, and we can, as intelligent beings, much more carefully select than nature would in any sort of random way. But as we try to characteristically select for certain traits, what happens is the animal becomes unstable, and most of the more purebred animals have some sort of characteristic downside. And if you take a bunch of purebred animals and you put them to the wild and let them commingle again, you'll find that they actually do revert back to the sort of the more general, what we would term in dogs as mutts. And that happens in all sorts of life. I mean, they breed bees and other types of insects as they can turn around the life cycle on very quickly. But what happens is, yes, they can get with 2 wings, but they're not functional. And even though it's as if these types have boundaries that they can't get past. And when we look at the fossil record, that's pretty much what we also see. We see very long periods of stability with short periods. You can qualify that as geologically short periods, but they're short enough that we can't tell whether they're a day or a million years. But they're short periods of change. And so what happens to allow that bridge to jump from microevolution to macroevolution, which would allow for the changes that would not just result in a Sheltie and a Great Dane, but a Sheltie and a cat? Those types of changes, we have no idea how those occurred.
Do you not go for the punctuated equilibrium idea on that?
Well, I think that's a good description of the fossil record, but there's no explanation there. It just explains that the fossil record is steady for long periods of time, and then there's short periods of something happening, we don't know what, and then you get another long periods of change. The best explanations for those, by the way, are these extinction periods where, again, they don't know why, whether it's a huge solar flare or whether it's a large, sometimes they know it's a large meteor, or a large meteor plays a role in that, but there's just huge amounts of unknowns in all that. We don't know what happens to cause extinctions. We've got some ideas and some theories, but even if you can explain the dying off of all these animals, it doesn't explain the sudden emergence of all these new species.
Okay. So, Alan, do you feel that that puts any holes in your argument at all?
No, not really. I don't think it really does at all. I mean, it does mean that there's just some things that we still have yet to understand and explain. But, you know, it seems to me that, again, as I tried to make the case in my post, is that when one looks at the entire universe, one sees an evolutionary unfolding. And even now we know the universe is expanding. So there is a sense in which creation in some way is still happening. I think the other thing is genetics. You know, we share 98% of our DNA with the chimpanzee. Now, that simply cannot be an accident. Now, I agree, we're much different in intelligence and other things from chimpanzees, obviously. We are in the image of God in a way that chimps are not. But you know, the other thing about genetics is we do know that in mapping the human genome, for example, that in our chromosomes and our genes, that there are what appear to be evolutionary dead ends. It's almost as if at one point some of our chromosomes served a purpose, but for some reason now no longer do. And then, you know, I mean, we could go down as that in mapping the genome, we've discovered that we are really descendant from several thousand hominids. And so it just seems to me that while there are certainly things we don't understand and can't explain, that the overall character of the universe and the world is one of evolutionary process.
Mm-hmm. I have to admit, I tend to agree with you. I read somewhere that I share about 85% of my genes with a banana, which...
That makes you very appealing, Chris.
Thank you so much. I didn't set that up for you deliberately, but... yeah, I see the process working. Do we need to explain every little step by it in order for it to be convincing as the mechanism, Elgin?
We have to have some explanation. Right now we have zero. I don't think the microevolution that gives you dogs and, you know, canines and Shelties and Great Danes works for giving you species. And in fact, the evidence seems to be against that, because the more change you put into a particular trait that you're trying to get, the more unstable the animal becomes. I would comment, there is a bit of agreement with Alan in that I do see, quote, a macroevolutionary process. I guess maybe if I put it this way, I see the universe has been designed for man. It's what scientists refer to as the anthropic principle. Mm-hmm. And it's been designed in an extremely careful way that change some values. I calculated out once that if you change one of the, I don't remember exactly what it's in my book, but if you change one of the relation, I think it's between the weak and the strong nuclear force or something, by the equivalent of one paper clip in the size of the sun, that would prohibit life from ever appearing. Mm-hmm. So I agree there's this overall trend towards development. I don't think science has explained that. I mean, for example, we haven't even talked about how life got started in the first place, which the more we look into that, the more miraculous it becomes. I mean, when Stanley Miller did, and I can't think of the other guy's name, did the experiment that produced amino acids back in the 40s, they thought, oh, we got this nailed. We'll be building life by the 70s or the 80s. But we haven't been able to. And the more we get into it, the harder it becomes. And now the science shows that the early atmosphere of the Earth wasn't anywhere near as conducive as they thought it was. So you have to get life going in the first place. And I guess my thing is, if you're going to have a theory that says this is how it evolves, you actually have to have a plausible explanation how you get from one step to the next.
Well, I'm in agreement with the universe is a finely tuned instrument. I think of Alistair McGrath's wonderful book, A Fine-Tuned Universe, which I think is very helpful in this kind of thing. So, I mean, where I think, Elgin, where you and I agree is that if anyone is, for those who argue that evolutionary theory omits God, or Stephen Hawking, I think, has said recently, is that what we know of the universe means we really don't need God. Certainly, I disagree with that. It's not. I mean, the issue here, I think, is not the why, but the how. How did all this happen? How did all this develop? The why, Christian faith insists, is God, and the why of the purpose of the universe, et cetera, et cetera. That's the theological reflection that we engage in. But what we're dealing with is the question of how, and I think it's a mistake to read the Genesis text as giving us the how. How did it happen? I don't think that's what the text. I don't think those are the. I don't think the text is answering those questions.
I tend to agree with you on that. That's why I said it can be made to fit or not fit any number of different theories. For me, the Genesis text teaches two really big points. One, that God created the universe and everything in it. Two, it puts us in our place in the universe into perspective. And those are the two main points. In fact, one of the troubles I have with this debate often is that it obscures what is actually, to me, the main point of the text, is
right.
Where do we fit in the scheme of things? And I think Genesis text does that very well. And is it going to give me a good scientific? I have an example in my book where I said, I translate the let there be light, but instead of this, I just say let there be, and then I have it printed out the Maxwell's equations, which technically is saying the same thing, but how many people would actually understand what Maxwell's equations are? And can we even confidently say that that's even now the full and complete picture? Science is looking after the grand unified theory. There's some debate about whether that's ever going to even exist or not, but assuming for the sake that it is, and God was to give us to us in Genesis, would we even understand it today, and what would it have meant to all the people who came before us, or the people before Newton that didn't understand what calculus was? You have to understand calculus to understand Maxwell's equations.
I also think an important part of biblical hermeneutics is that we need to attempt to understand how the original hearers would have understood this.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not suggesting that's an easy thing, always. But to me, there's kind of a little bit, if I might say it this way, I think sometimes the 21st century Christians there's a little bit of arrogance that somehow we think that the Scripture was written directly to us in the 21st century, and it was not. When the biblical writers were writing, they didn't have any of us in mind. Theologically, we believe Scripture is written for us. It's written for all of us, but it wasn't written to us. And so you have to ask the question, how would these people have heard these texts, these stories? Again, I'm not suggesting that is necessarily always easy to determine, but that is a critical part of good biblical interpretation. And by the way, let me say another thing, and I mentioned this in my post. There is this mythology out there that the church unanimously interpreted Genesis 1 and 2 literally for 2,000 years, and then when Darwin came along, all of a sudden, and Chris, you're shaking your head, but this is in America, okay? Then all of a sudden Darwin comes along, and all of a sudden now we're talking about metaphor or figurative or allegory and all that, as if somehow there was this unanimous perspective of the church. And all you got to do is read Augustine to know. I mean, Augustine himself was cautioning about reading these texts literally. And not that there weren't those who did, there were. But my point is that in 2,000 years of biblical interpretation in the church, how to understand these texts has been debated. And so it's not all of a sudden in the last 150 years the church has done about face on this.
Yeah, I actually think Bishop Ussher, who came up with the 4004 date, I think he's actually been pushed more by the atheists as to try and show how ignorant Christians are than Christians ever, because he wasn't universally accepted. There's always, I think the debate with Darwin, I think some of that did is it crystallized and forced people into camps that didn't actually need to be crystallized or forced into camps.
Yeah, I agree with you. We need to quit allowing the atheists to determine the discussion on this within the church. I don't mean that we shouldn't have a discussion with people who have different perspectives from us. But I am not interested in primarily understanding the biblical text on the heels of atheist critique. I really, to be honest, I'm not overly interested in what Richard Dawkins thinks. And when he rejects the existence of God, the God as he understands the God of the Bible, my response always is, well, if I don't believe in that God either. I don't believe in the caricature that Richard Dawkins has set up. So if that's the God we're talking about, I don't believe in that God either. And I think we need to quit. I'm not saying we shouldn't have an answer. I'm just saying I'm not going to be doing my theology and thinking about these issues on my heels in responding to Richard Dawkins.
Yeah. And I think as an important, at least for me, an important point is that as an apologist, someone who does spend time defending the gospel, I never want to be put in a position of putting stumbling blocks in people's way. So, I basically do not even raise the issue unless that's a problem that somebody has. And if they do, one of the things I point out is that there's a range of opinion within the Christian church, even today and always has been, as to what these texts mean. What's central isn't how God created the universe, as important that is. What's central is what Christ did at the cross.
That's right.
And that's where I want people to focus their attention.
Okay, what appears to me, and I am not a biologist, I am originally a physicist. So, for a physicist, chemists are messy physicists, and biologists are even messier chemists with an added yuck factor. As a physicist, I don't see any requirement for there to be new mechanisms or major changes in any of the mechanisms since quite an early period in the history of the universe. There is one change, which is the hyperinflation leveling off, which is not explained at the moment. But otherwise, I don't see room for additional factors intervening historically. The position seems to me to be a bit different with biology. On the whole, I do not see a micromanaging interventionary God as being a viable understanding of God for me. Do your points of view make you more open to the more micromanaging form?
Who are you directing that?
I made the point in my post. I pick up on John Polkinghorne's point that God also allows the universe to freely to make itself, and we talked about that.
Yeah.
I'm not completely comfortable with the way we set up the argument of intervention because in some ways it almost seems to posit this idea that somehow God is outside the process and then every now and then gets into the process from outside, whereas I think the biblical view is much is where God is involved. God is here now. And so where God is guiding and directing, where God is allowing this to make itself, I think that's just something we can't know. I don't expect, by the way, the physicists to look at these processes and say, oh, there we can see God's hand, and here we can't. I don't think that's something we can know. I think God is here, God is involved in the process, and how God is involved in the process, along with allowing the freedom of the universe to do its thing, in a sense, is just, I think that's the most, that, from my perspective, that's the most that can be said.
I think I largely agree with that. I think they asked the question of whether God is. I don't believe God in a deist sense where he, got the watch all wound up and then stepped back and just let it take its course. On the other hand, I don't see God as someone who's constantly meddling in like a cook who's constantly adding spices or stirring the pot or whatever. How God interacts is and when, I don't know. I do see interaction in the broad picture of the anthropic principle, and it's just so completely improbable, that if something didn't happen the way it is, we wouldn't be here. That we're here is in and of itself a miracle. I would say probably in the literal sense. So, but I guess when it comes to science, I don't expect science to be able to crank up and do an experiment and say, yes, this is God interacting, because that reduces God to a physical force.
Yes.
I guess where I get in, I'm not actually, I understand the resistance to intelligent design theory, although I don't think it's completely legitimate in terms of rejecting it, at least as a consideration. On the other hand, I'm not comfortable with, when I read a lot of evolutionary literature or scientific literature, I keep seeing this one line and it just drives me nuts, which is, well, it must have happened because we're here. I don't see it must have happened because we're here any more of a scientific explanation as God finger touched and it miraculously happened. To me, they're both, they're statements of faith. They're not scientific statements. And I see an awful lot of, well, it must have happened because we are here. Or life must. I'm reading a book recently, and the author's a secular author basically said the creation of life must be easy because it happened very early on this planet.
Well,
that's how they get past a lot of the gaps in evolution and in science.
Well, from everything I've read, it looks like that the universe, while containing all the building blocks for life, doesn't look like that it's predisposed to generate life easily.
No.
Certainly not. And there's an astrophysicist, John Gibbon, who wrote a book called Alone in the Universe, and he is, I don't know if he has any faith convictions at all, but basically when he goes through, and Elgin, I think this is something you would resonate with, when he goes through and he talks about all the things that we know that had to happen to create not just life, but intelligent life on Earth, and to form intelligent life. He said it's astounding. It's just astounding. And so then he asked the question, are we alone, and ultimately in the universe? And ultimately we can't answer that question, I think, considering that there's so much of the universe we don't even have any clue about. But he says, when you look at the odds, he says, one thing is for sure, intelligent life is not teeming in the universe.
No.
It just isn't. Just because of the odds.
Yeah, Carl Sagan did his famous calculation on, I think, 4 or 5 parameters and came out with his billions and billions of planets that can support life. But that was only 4. Last time I did the calculations, it was up and around, or looked into the calculations, it was up around 30 to 40. And I understand it's up into the 50s now. But when I saw them, at 30 or 40, I don't remember exactly what the number was, but I do remember what the odds are. The odds were in the entire universe with all the galaxies that there was less than 1 in 100th of a chance that there would be one planet that would support intelligent life like ourselves. And it's so many, I mean, for example, even the moon. If it wasn't for the moon, we wouldn't be here, and the moon was only an off-chance encounter. We got struck, according to the theory, we got struck by a huge planetary object moving through the solar system, and that ejected the moon and got us here.
I've never been particularly impressed with arguments based on probabilities, I have to admit. I mean, the probability, all other things being equal, that this child born in 1953 would be on a Friday evening hosting a discussion program on Christian subjects must at the time have been incredibly small, but the probability of it actually happening is 1. So there are all sorts of other possibilities of which the actual probabilities are now 0, and were probably a lot higher back then. I think we can deceive ourselves very easily with that. I do think one of the major deceptions of that is multiverse theories, incidentally, which I've not just heard as an explanation in physics, as you alluded to, Elgin. I've also heard it put forward in theological circles as an answer to the free will versus determinism question.
I have a huge problem with multiverse theories.
I thought you might. I don't like them very much either. I think Thomas of Occam had more or less the right idea, and you shouldn't multiply metaphysical entities, and alternate universes are definitely metaphysical entities. So yes,
I agree with you on the probabilities, although I would argue that they're not completely useless. I mean, I've heard it put. The probability of seeing a car with a particular license plate passing by you on Thursday afternoon, but when you given the probabilities that a car would pass you by and it would have a license plate is a little bit different. On the other hand, I think if we're going to play the game, when Carl Sagan was a well-known atheist, played the game arguing that we cannot be special creations because the universe is teeming with life, and look at this calculation I did that said there were billions and billions of planets out there. I think it's legitimate to come along and look at the complete list of factors and say that's not quite right.
Mm-hmm. I think there's one other thing, which, picking up on something you said much earlier on, springs to mind. You were talking about us breeding animals and producing major problems. Animals breed themselves with far more success than we do when we interfere with the process. Natural processes still work in ways which we can't entirely understand. And if that isn't enough to make us humble, considering all the advances that science has made, we're really not looking closely enough at how much we don't know.
I guess that's actually my fundamental point, is that I don't think we know enough yet. That's why I'm not saying evolution is wrong and therefore we should toss it out, or it must have been 7-day creation, or I'm agnostic when it comes to the whole issue of how did God do it. I firmly believe He did, but I don't know the mechanism. I don't know how He did it. I'm not opposed to literal creationism. I'm not opposed to 7-day creationism, because the whole issue of things like what do we know and how. There's so many different assumptions. I don't accept them, but I'm not as afraid of error. Maybe this is the way to put it. I'm not as afraid of error as some people seem to be. One story that really impacted me was Einstein's opposition to quantum physics. He was a fierce opponent of it, and he came up with all these reasons why it had to be wrong. And out of his error, scientists have constructed some actually pretty valuable experiments that gave some real insight that probably never would have happened had he not been wrong and been arguing about it. And I think the history of science is full of people who were clearly wrong and way outside the mainstream, only to decades later be turned around and found out that they actually were correct all along. So I'm very content to say I don't know. I don't think evolution has the answer. I don't think literal creationists have the answer, and I'm content to sit back and let them battle it out and see who comes up with the better arguments. And all I know is that I do believe God created the universe, and I'm content with that for now.
I wonder sometimes if we would be having this discussion if Genesis chapters 1 and 2 did not exist. Because it just seems to me that behind this discussion continues to be how we read those texts. Mm-hmm. And I was watching a documentary a couple of years ago on this whole issue of Darwin and creation, and I actually was listening to, these are people who are trained scientifically at the Creation Museum that's here in the United States, the big one in Kentucky, and hearing these scientists saying, because of their understanding of how Genesis 1 and 2 must be interpreted literally, that the science must line up with that. Mm-hmm. And that we need to figure out how the science lines up with that, which I find to be just faulty on many levels. But the point is, if we didn't have these texts, would this even be a discussion? And so, again, it tells me that maybe, again, I'm not agnostic on this issue. I think the evolutionary nature of the universe and the world is very clear. Yes, there are holes. Yes, there are things that we do not understand. But as an old fishing buddy of mine who was a chemist used to say to me when we have these discussions while fishing for bass, there's nothing better than discussing theology and science and fishing at the same time. He would say it's the scientist's job to come up with this hypothesis and then spend the rest of his life trying to prove he's wrong. Yeah. And so just because we discover something is not correct doesn't throw the whole thing into doubt. It just means that we don't understand it completely.
Well, you could also make the same argument, to personalize it. If Huxley hadn't been one of the first people that got the book and drove, the thing about evolution is it was immediately on day one used as a club to clobber Christians.
Sure.
I think started the whole back and forth that I alluded to, and if we weren't fighting over Genesis 1, we would be fighting over Noah's Ark, or we'd be fighting over a whole slew of different things. The battles would have come one way or the other, because ultimately it's.
But what I'm going to say, Elgin, in reference to that, is that's why I think that, at least for Christians in this debate, this first and foremost isn't about science, it's about hermeneutics. It's about biblical interpretation. It's how are we reading these texts. And so if the assumption is, right off the bat, you've got to read this literally, as in the how this happened, then that's going to make a difference than for how you look at the issue scientifically. And I think that that's what this ultimately boils down to, is how do we read these texts. And I think here's what I think one of the sad things about the discussion is that for those of us who do not read Genesis 1 and 2 literally, because we don't believe that's the best way to read the text, we get questioned about our belief in the authority of Scripture. Yeah. And the issue is not, when it comes to the authority of Scripture, the issue is not a particular reading that's authoritative. It's the Scripture that's authoritative. And then we can have the discussion about exactly how to best read these texts. So I think ultimately this is the thing that's swirling around in the atmosphere of this discussion.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of agree with you on that, although you know, to take the other side, their side of the argument, their interpretation is just as valid. I don't want to start with the assumption that they're wrong and therefore they have to agree with me.
No, I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting. I'm just not suggesting.
I agree with you on the authority part, but I'm not willing to say their understanding of Genesis 1 is wrong. I don't agree with it, but
their literal interpretation has certainly been an interpretation in the church. There's no doubt about that. Historically, you cannot deny that, and you therefore cannot simply dismiss it. But I also don't think all readings of Scripture are created equal. And so I don't want to get off on that subject, but just simply to say, I think part of this discussion is the sign that the reading of the text is so interwoven with this discussion that that's part and parcel of what we're really having here, not so much the discussion of genes and chromosomes and DNA.
Well, I would argue that a literal 7-day creationist who wants the science to line up with the Bible is no more right or wrong than the secular atheist who wants the science to exclude any concept of God.
Well, I'm a little different on that. I would say they're both wrong.
Well,
that's kind of what I agree.
Oh, did you say that? Okay, all right.
I have to say I also differ on that. I am probably even further to the other end of this discussion than Alan is. I am a thoroughgoing methodological naturalist. I am always going to look for naturalistic, non-supernatural explanations for everything. And while I stop just short of saying there cannot be any other explanation, it is virtually impossible for me to believe in a non-naturalistic explanation for things. So I have to interpret Scripture without the supernatural, broadly speaking. And I have, therefore, huge difficulties with people who come along to me and say, this is the literal interpretation of Genesis, you have to believe this. I can't do it. And a lot of other people I know can't do it either.
I'm not sure I could even do it. But that sounds like a much bigger topic than we got since we're over time.
It is. And we are over time at this point. So, and have you got a parting shot, Alan?
No, other than to say maybe, as Elgin said something earlier, or something that he reads now and then, is that it all must be true because the three of us are here.
Splendid. That'll do for me. Thanks to both of you and to the audience. Have a great week and hope to see you next Friday.
All right, thank you.